The club lights pulse softly across the crowded room as she steps onto the small stage, her silver dress catching hints of navy smoke drifting upward, and everything seems suspended just long enough for you to wonder whether your heart will actually survive what comes next tonight. Her voice slides into the first notes, warm and unhurried, drifting through the speakeasy like a secret passed quietly between strangers, and he watches from a dim corner booth where shadows cling to his tailored suit, as though trying to hide him from recognition. Chicago in the 1920s hums beneath every chord she sings, carrying the restless tension of prohibition, the steady thrum of hidden doors, and the soft anxiety that chases musicians who know too well how easily a melody can draw the wrong kind of attention. She pauses between verses to sip water, smiling at a couple whispering near the stage, and quirks an eyebrow at the bartender who always pretends not to hear rumours about the syndicate, though he collects secrets the way gamblers collect unpaid markers behind closed rooms. A lone saxophonist leans into a blue note, reminding everyone that jazz grew sharp edges in places where danger breathes close, and tonight feels no different as her voice wraps around the room with a softness that hides its fear of unseen eyes studying her. He sits with a glass of rye he barely tastes, the kind brewed illegally in old warehouses near the river, silently appreciating how she keeps the beat steady, even when laughter rises too loud. A small skill musicians often learn after surviving rowdy midnight crowds. Rumour has it she once left a note for a drummer who disappeared after crossing a minor gang lieutenant, though no one knows if the story's true, and she'd likely laugh if anyone asked, brushing the idea away like smoke lingering on her shoulders. The mobster's gaze stays fixed on her, not hungry or cruel, just quiet in that unsettling way people notice only when they have already realised the room's energy has shifted, though the brass section keeps playing as though nothing unusual vibrates beneath the polished wood floor. A historical detail floats through the moment. Jazz clubs of the era often hired spotters to signal police raids, and one stands near the back door tonight tapping a cigarette thoughtfully as if debating whether the evening's rhythm carries trouble hidden between its softer measures. She finishes a verse with a playful tilt of her head, amused by a whisper she overhears from two patrons arguing about baseball, and the light joke relaxes her enough to forget, briefly, how threads of danger sometimes weave themselves gently through her nightly routines. He notices the shift in her shoulders, the way she inhales a little deeper before the next chorus, and considers ordering flowers under a false name later, a habit he formed after realizing gifts are less threatening when they arrive without the weight of recognition. A quirky tidbit says some Chicago singers kept Lucky Charms stitched inside their dresses. Coins, tiny charms, even folded sheet music. And she carries a small brass button behind her hem. Not because she believes in luck, but because it once belonged to someone she trusted. Historians still argue whether certain performers truly sensed who in the audience carried power during Prohibition nights. Yet her brief glance toward his shadowed booth feels instinctive, like she hears a second rhythm beneath the band's arrangement, one warning her to treat the moment gently. The crowd settles deeper into their chairs, lulled by the smoky tenderness spreading from her final drawn-out note, and the room grows warmer as though leaning in to listen, unaware of the subtle current beginning to coil between the singer and the man watching intently. She lowers the microphone, steps back with a half-smile shaped by exhaustion and mischief, and the soft thrill of knowing he is still staring finds her unexpectedly steady, even as she senses tonight may open a path she cannot easily retreat from once crossed. He lingers in his shadowed booth as her next set begins, pretending to study the drink he no longer cares for, aware that every note she releases lands somewhere uncomfortably close to the place he keeps locked from the world. She senses the weight of his attention tonight, a quiet gravitational pull that shouldn't matter, but somehow steadies her nerves, and she tells herself it's only stage intuition, even though she jokes inwardly that intuition rarely shows up this consistently on weekdays. The band shifts into a slower number, a tune borrowed from New Orleans traditions that travelled upriver, reminding everyone that jazz often moved illegally just like liquor, though such parallels are mostly shrugged off unless someone is already feeling sentimental or overly poetic after midnight. He leans forward slightly when she glances his way, unsure whether she actually saw him or simply felt the room change, and he almost smiles at the thought that danger has taught him more about subtlety than any expensive etiquette book ever could. A passing waitress whispers that he's from the North Side mob territory, though she admits she might be wrong because gangsters don't usually tip politely, and the singer laughs quietly, deciding it's safer not to assume anything about men who stare too gently. Historical detail drifts in with the brass section. By 1926, Chicago hosted over 1,000 speakeasies, many controlled by rival syndicates whose alliances shifted weekly, creating a city where a wrong glance could ruin a night faster than a sour horn note. She steps closer to the front of the stage, letting the spotlight graze her cheek as she holds a long note that surprises even her, though she jokes inwardly that impressive notes tend to appear conveniently whenever someone mysterious is watching. He studies the way she softens the final syllable, noticing the caution tucked between her breaths, and he wonders whether she carries a hidden story, as most performers did in those days, one woven from debts, past loves, or the small heartbreaks nobody ever records. A quirky tidbit says some Chicago mobsters kept tiny notebooks of favourite performers, ranking them like bettors listed horses, and he imagines how ridiculous he'd look doing the same, considering he's already lost the illusion of emotional detachment tonight. She moves to the piano between songs, running her fingers along the edge as though greeting an old friend, and the gesture feels intimate enough that he shifts uncomfortably, realizing affection can appear in unexpected textures long before it's spoken aloud. The crowd sways as she begins another tune, unaware of the quiet tension between them, and she allows herself a tiny smile, half amusement, half warning, because she knows attention from the wrong man can be both thrilling and catastrophically inconvenient. Historians still argue whether singers of the era truly recognised mob figures in their audiences or merely guessed based on posture and hats. Yet her sideways glance toward him feels too precise to be random, as though she senses a story forming behind him. He lowers his gaze briefly, pretending to adjust his cufflinks, a nervous habit he hasn't used since boyhood, and he silently curses the way vulnerability returns whenever someone unexpected begins to read him more clearly than he prefers. She ends the song with a bright flourish, earning warm applause that rolls like soft thunder through the room, and she steadies herself on the piano bench, acknowledging internally that curiosity is becoming a dangerous rhythm she might not resist. The lights dim slightly as the band transitions again, and the unspoken tether between them draws tighter, carrying the unmistakable promise that tonight their paths shift irrevocably, though neither yet knows how deeply they will be pulled into each other's shadowed world. She slips into the backstage hallway between sets, letting the heavy door thud shut behind her and the sudden quiet feels like stepping out of sunlight into evening, gentle, cool, and unsettling in the way silence always is when emotions outpace explanations. He follows minutes later, not intentionally chasing her, or so he insists to himself, though his careful gait suggests someone battling impulses sharpened by years of learning when to approach and when to vanish, before trouble even knows his name. She leans against a crate of sheet music, steadying her breath, pretending she's only catching a moment's rest, even though she can still feel the weight of his earlier gaze resting somewhere along her pulse, like a question she refuses to answer yet. He stops at the far end of the hallway, close enough to acknowledge her presence, far enough to offer safety, and he clears his throat softly, as though rehearsing a line he has used countless times, yet suddenly finds wholly inadequate. She asks whether he's enjoying the music, half teasing, half cautious, expecting a smooth reply, but his simple nod unsettles her more than flirtation would, because sincerity from dangerous men is rarely simple and often carries warning bells disguised as compliments. The club's muffled trumpets remind them as Chicago's underground was flourishing by 1927, with jazz musicians caught between fame and risk, and she wonders, not without humour, why attractive listeners always appear whenever her week is already chaotic enough to guarantee regret. He compliments her phrasing on the last chorus, noting the slight tremor she hid beautifully, and she feels oddly exposed, as if he's describing a secret tattoo no one notices, though she covers her reaction by joking that tremors are free entertainment. She steps sideways to reach her dressing room, but he moves slightly to give her more space, surprising her with caution, unusual for men his reputation hints at, and she wonders whether kindness is his strategy or simply an inconvenient truth. A quirky tidbit says some Chicago speakeasies stored liquor behind false mirrors that slid open with piano chords, and she glances at the backstage wall, wondering whether any secrets hide there too, though tonight she suspects bigger ones stand right in front of her. He finally asks whether she feels safe working here, an unexpected question that tightens the air, and she answers vaguely, refusing to admit she's been uneasy for weeks, especially since someone has been leaving folded notes beneath her doorstep without explanation. Historians still argue whether performers and mobsters formed genuine bonds or merely transactional alliances, yet her careful tone suggests a fragile bridge forming now, built less on desire than on the strange comfort of being truly observed without negotiation. She notices his hesitation, as though he's contemplating revealing something personal, and for a moment she imagines an entirely different version of him, someone who once loved quietly before learning shadows are safer than sincerity, even when sincerity waits patiently in hallways. He finally says her voice deserves a room without danger, a sentiment surprisingly gentle for a man rumoured to command fear, and she laughs softly, teasing that danger pays better than applause, even though humour fails to mask her lingering unease. The hallway lamp flickers, casting them into brief darkness, and when the light returns she feels strangely aware of him, aware of the warmth he radiates, aware of the risk he embodies, aware of the path already shifting beneath her unwilling feet. She excuses herself with a half smile, slipping into her dressing room before emotions sharpen further, unaware that tonight's brief hallway encounter will become the first secret neither can comfortably name, yet both will remember long after the music fades. She returns to the stage with steadier breath, though the hallway encounter lingers behind her ribs like a half-caught melody, and as the audience murmurs back into focus, she senses the night shifting, thick with the familiar ache of choices arriving too soon. He resumes his seat in the corner booth, smoother now, reclaiming the disguise of a man uninterested, even though the faint tremor in his wrist betrays him, hinting that whatever happened backstage has tangled more deeply than either intended. The band launches into a Prohibition-era favourite, a tune once banned in certain districts for attracting rowdier crowds, and she softens her voice around the rhythm, amused by the irony that rules rarely stop people when desire has already made the first decision. He watches her reclaim the room effortlessly, as though the earlier tension never occurred, and he marvels, quietly, grudgingly, that few people can navigate danger with such poise, a skill usually learned only by those who've lost something worth protecting. She notices the bartender's wary glance toward his booth, a subtle reminder that alliances in Chicago can snap like overplayed strings, and she forces herself to stay composed, joking inwardly that musicians deserve hazard pay for emotional turbulence alone. A historical detail settles into the moment. Prohibition agents raided nearly 10 clubs this month, pushing performers into uneasy truces with whoever controlled the safest streets, a reality she pretends doesn't bother her even though it gnaws behind each carefully shaped note. He lifts his glass in a small, silent acknowledgement toward her, not flirtatious, simply honest, and the unexpected tenderness of it coils through her, as though someone opened a window in winter, letting in cold clarity she isn't ready to welcome. She switches to a quieter ballad, leaning into the microphone with a vulnerability she usually avoids, and the room shifts to a hush, unaware they're witnessing a private confession disguised as melody, the kind only one specific listener will understand tonight. A quirky tidbit claims certain Chicago clubs adjusted lighting to flatter favoured performers, and she wonders whether the warm amber drifting over her now is coincidence or a subtle gesture from a staff member who's been silently shipping her with the mysterious stranger. He sits straighter when she glances his way again, sensing the fragile line drawn between music and meaning, and he resists the urge to approach her afterward, knowing proximity has consequences even when intentions feel deceptively pure. Historians still argue whether jazz singers intentionally guided emotions towards specific patrons or simply performed to the room, yet her measured pauses tonight feel almost like coded messages, shaped for one person sitting where shadows protect him best. She feels something shift when he lowers his gaze, not in retreat but recognition, and she realizes their unspoken thread no longer hides comfortably beneath the noise, humming through the space like an overtone she can't unhear. He considers leaving early to sever the growing tension, but loyalty, rare, quiet, inconvenient, roots him to the seat, as though fate tucked an invisible hand onto his shoulder, whispering that unfinished moments deserve their chance to unfold. She ends the ballad with a softened exhale, tasting the vulnerability she allowed to slip through, and it startles her to realize she wasn't performing for applause tonight, so much as reaching towards something she doesn't yet dare to name. He rises slightly as she steps back from the spotlight, their eyes meeting with the understated certainty of two people who know the night will not end untouched, even if neither is prepared for the shadows preparing to close in around them. The applause fades as she slips backstage again, unaware that a pair of unfamiliar eyes watches her from the far end of the corridor, belonging to a man whose presence drags an older ache to the surface, stirring jealousy thick enough to cling to the evening's smoky breath and sharpen every shadow around her. He notices the stranger too, sensing territorial tension shift like a loaded dice across a table, and although he remains still, his instincts coil with practiced precision, remembering past nights when jealous rivals sparked violence faster than spilled liquor, especially in Chicago where emotional entanglements often carried consequences heavier than debt. She freezes briefly when the stranger steps forward, a ghost from a chapter she tried to bury, someone who once loved her with reckless tenderness before vanishing without explanation, and now his sudden return tightens something in her chest she had hoped was finally numb enough to ignore. The mobster reads her expression instantly, jealousy flickering in him with a quiet burn he dislikes admitting, for he's learned that emotions reveal weakness in a city where trust dissolves quickly, yet he cannot stop the involuntary protectiveness rising like a tide he pretends doesn't exist. A historical detail threads through the tension. By late 1927, intergang jealousy fueled countless street ambushes, sometimes sparked not by territory or money but by romantic rivalry. And she knows this all too well because musicians often became unwilling accessories to stories written in cigarette ash and regret. The stranger asks whether she still sings the lullaby he wrote for her, and though the question is gentle, it splinters the moment with sentimental sharpness. Forcing her to answer lightly while praying, the mobster doesn't notice the tremor sliding beneath her practiced smile. A quirky tidbit says some performers used old love letters as makeshift sheet music bookmarks, and she suddenly recalls the folded note hidden under her pillow. A note she thought came from an admirer, though now she wonders whether it belonged to this man resurfacing inconveniently tonight. Historians still argue whether jealousy among Chicago's criminal circles intensified more from romantic entanglements or financial rivalry, yet the tension now twisting the air around them feels undeniably personal, shaped by unspoken memories and the quiet warfare of two men assessing each other through her silence. She steps back, attempting to reclaim control, but the mobster closes the distance calmly, offering her an exit with a simple nod that feels surprisingly gentle. And she takes it, knowing every choice tonight may echo far louder than any lyric she sings on stage. As they walk toward the stage entrance together, the stranger's lingering stare trails after her like an unfinished sentence, and she senses that jealousy, hers, his, theirs, will soon tip something fragile. Pulling all three into a storm neither can escape once the final note lands. The moment she steps back into the dressing room corridor, a sudden hush falls over the staff, the kind that forms when news travels faster than footsteps, and she instantly senses that something has shifted, an invisible fracture rippling beneath the velvet curtains, carrying the faint metallic taste of betrayal she cannot yet name. He enters seconds later, reading the stiffness in the room with trained ease, noticing how two stagehands avoid eye contact, as though guarding a secret too fragile to speak, and his instincts sharpen into the same cold precision he uses when business deals sour without warning. She asks what happened, but nobody answers, and instead a folded slip of paper appears on her makeup table. Written in a rushed hand, warning that someone within the club has been selling information about her nightly routines, turning her safety into currency traded behind locked doors. The mobster picks up the note before she can touch it, recognizing the coded symbols used by certain informants tied loosely to his rivals, and the realization shakes loose a quiet fury he masks with a steady breath, aware that panic only deepens traps set by unseen hands. A historical detail whispers through the tension. During Prohibition, betrayal often moved through speakeasies like second-hand smoke, lingering in curtains and stairwells, because information about performers, especially women linked to powerful men, was valuable enough to ignite turf wars or quiet disappearances no newspaper ever bothered to record. She steadies herself against the vanity, feeling the old fear return, the same fear that once pushed her to flee the stranger now resurfacing, and she wonders whether the past has arrived to sabotage her present, or whether tonight's danger belongs entirely to this new, complicated connection. A quirky tidbit claims some Chicago nightclubs hid microphones inside floral arrangements to eavesdrop on guests, and she studies the lilies near her mirror suspiciously, half joking to herself that paranoia is becoming a full-time hobby, even though humour barely disguises the truth settling heavily in her ribs. Historians still argue whether betrayals in the jazz world stemmed mostly from personal grudges or criminal manipulation. Yet the energy in the room tonight feels like a merging of both, intimate enough to slice, strategic enough to dismantle lives without leaving fingerprints. He steps closer, lowering his voice as he promises to find out who's targeting her, and though the vow is quiet, it carries an unmistakable violence beneath its softness, the kind he only reveals when someone threatens what little goodness he still allows himself to care about. She nods, though fear tightens her throat, sensing that whatever betrayal has been set in motion now binds their fates more tightly than any confession could, and as they leave the dressing room the velvet curtains billow slightly, as if the club itself is exhaling before the storm arrives. She steps back onto the stage for the final set, carrying the weight of the warning note like a stone beneath her ribs, and although her smile remains intact, the gentle tremor in her fingers betrays an unease she tries to bury beneath the warm haze of stage lights. He watches from the corner booth, posture deceptively relaxed, though his senses sharpen at every shift in the crowd, reading gestures and whispers the way others read sheet music, knowing that danger rarely announces itself with grand theatrics, but slips quietly through doorways already cracked open. The band eases into a slow tune, one she reserves for nights that feel fragile, and she pours her voice into it with a softness that feels almost like goodbye, even though she jokes inwardly that dramatic exits only belong in movies, not smoky Chicago clubs dripping with uncertainty. A stranger near the bar signals subtly to another man, and the mobster catches the exchange instantly, recognizing the same coded movement used by rival crews during tense weeks of 1928, when alliances rearranged like crooked playing cards, often turning dance floors into battlegrounds of silent threats. She senses his tension even from the stage, reading the stiffness in his shoulders, and she allows the final chorus to linger longer than usual, hoping the melody's warmth can slow the unravelling thread between them, though she knows music rarely stops storms already gathering. A quirky tidbit claims certain jazz singers could detect danger by noting who stopped tapping their feet first, and tonight she spots 3 men frozen unnaturally still, the rhythm passing through them without response. Sending a nervous jolt down her spine, she tries to mask behind polished phrasing. Historians still argue whether this particular night marked a turning point in Chicago's criminal tensions, or merely reflected countless unrecorded conflicts simmering beneath the city's neon hum. Yet what unfolds now feels far too precise, too coordinated, to be coincidence. He rises slowly as the song nears its close, not rushing, simply positioning himself between her and the room, an instinct honed from years of surviving ambushes, and she feels a quiet ache knowing the man who makes her feel seen must also remain ready to bleed. She closes her eyes for the final sustained note, holding it longer than rehearsed, letting its warmth soften the edges of fear, and when she opens them again, she sees him watching her with an intensity that feels both like a promise and an apology. The applause swells but fails to wash away the dread coiling at her feet, and as she steps back from the microphone, the room seems to tilt, subtly, dangerously, making her realize that whatever awaits after this last song will demand a choice neither of them is prepared to make. The alley behind the club feels unusually tense as they step into the cool night, her breath still trembling from the final set, and before she can ask why he looks toward the rooftops, the sharp rhythm of approaching footsteps fractures the silence, carrying the unmistakable intent of men who do not come to negotiate. He moves instinctively, placing himself between her and the shadows, his voice low as he urges her to stay behind the stage door, and she barely has time to protest before figures emerge with the calculated steadiness of rivals, enacting a decision made long before tonight ever began. She calls his name, but he silences her with a small shake of the head, a gesture almost tender despite the danger, and she watches helplessly as he steps forward into the narrow space, shoulders squared not in arrogance but in resignation, as though he always suspected this night would claim its price. A historical detail shadows the moment. Several Chicago mobsters vanished in late 1928 under circumstances so quiet newspapers barely noticed. And now she realizes those rumors were not exaggerations but warnings, whispered through smoke-filled bars by people who understood that territory and love often collided without mercy. The first gunshot comes muted, swallowed by the alley walls, and although he manages to disarm one attacker with brutal precision, the second shot lands before she can reach him, a single violent punctuation that collapses the world she built around fragile music and unspoken promises. She kneels beside him as the attackers flee, her hands shaking as they hover above the wound he tries to hide. And he forces a faint smile, murmuring a quiet reassurance that sounds heartbreakingly like a farewell, shaped by the soft acceptance of a man who has run out of borrowed time. A quirky tidbit claims some Chicago singers believed final words carried protective magic, and though she never cared for superstition, she memorizes his last breath anyway, clutching it like a talisman, one that burns into her memory with devastating clarity she will carry for the rest of her life. Historians still argue whether his death resulted from jealousy, betrayal, or an unrelated territory feud, yet the police report filed that night remains suspiciously incomplete, containing only vague references to multiple unknown assailants, as though erasing him ensured the city could keep moving without acknowledging its ghosts. She disappears from the club within hours, leaving behind her dresses, sheet music, and the stage that knew her laughter, and witnesses later recall how she boarded a train at dawn, face hidden by a scarf carrying only a suitcase and the unbearable weight of silence. Months later, a singer with a new name appears in St. Louis, her voice familiar but steadier, marked by sorrow that listeners describe as strangely luminous. And though rumours trail her, none ever confirm the truth, that she once loved a man history tried very hard to forget. The night settles again, but much more softly now, as though the city itself exhales after holding its breath for too long. The echoes of their story drift outward, not in grand gestures or dramatic finales, but in small, gentle ripples that continue long after the alley empties, and the last patron has forgotten the melody she sang. You can almost hear it still, faint, fragile, a thread of sound stretched thin across time, refusing to disappear completely. And maybe that's how stories like theirs survive. Not in headlines or historical records, not in carefully kept archives, but in the quieter spaces where memory lingers, in the way a single note can feel heavy with longing, in the way a room grows still when a performer closes her eyes, in the quiet certainty that some truths cling to us even when the world chooses not to write them down. If you imagine the city now dim and resting, street lamps buzzing softly against the early morning haze, you might picture her walking alone with that small suitcase, not rushing, not breaking, just continuing forward with a steadiness she doesn't yet feel. The kind of steadiness people find only when they have lost something they weren't ready to lose. And somewhere inside that silence there is a tenderness, a gentleness that doesn't erase the pain but softens it just enough to breathe. Just enough to let the story settle into a place where it no longer hurts quite so sharply. If you're still awake or drifting somewhere between dreams and the dim outline of your room, let the last traces of their world fade slowly. Let everything grow quiet around you. Let the night smooth itself out again. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.